in 2022 in my lab, working on Hawaiian waterbirds and looking at various types of threats, sea level rise, predators, other types of things facing our waterbirds, then agreed to stay on working in kind of an equivalent to a postdoc position on a project that we've been dreaming about for a while, which is looking at how to optimize recovery of hundreds of species. In this case, on the 4 islands of Maui Nui, although we have dreams of expanding to the other Hawaiian islands when the project is complete. And so really excited. This is the first public presentation of these data, although they have been presented to the folks who contributed, the over 100 participants who contributed, but this is the first public presentation. So really excited for Kristen to present today. And I probably should also extol her virtues just a little bit more, as far as she also has mentored probably a dozen at least, if not more, graduate and probably then again undergraduate students, with undergraduate mentorship resulting in student research papers as well. So very proud to have been a part of Kristen's journey and excited to see her presentation today. So thank you so much, Kristen, for being here. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I also want to thank all of my sorry. Oh. Thank you. I also want to thank all of my co-authors, colleagues, folks that have contributed tremendously to this project outside of just Melissa and myself. We also want to extend a really big mahalo to all of our funding sources, as well as the participants. We had over 100 participants and contributors that made this project possible. They contributed their expertise and knowledge, so we thank them tremendously. Okay, so in conservation, we're very familiar with the many challenges that we face, and probably one of our biggest challenges is that we have so many species to protect, each of which have many threats, and there are many different threats, and we're trying to manage these threats with limited resources. And those actions that we can take, they all differ in their cost, benefit, and efficacy. So how do we decide which actions to take, where to take them, when we have hundreds of species to conserve in many different regions? And if we were to try to do this, this would not be computationally possible to evaluate all the potential actions for every individual species. However, we can group things. So for example, we can group species by how they respond, or that respond similarly to threats. And we can group, make about 15 to 20 spatially specific action sets, which we can then cost out and elicit the feasibility of each of those action sets. And we can also elicit the benefits of each of those action sets across the different species groups. And so this is this description is a process called priority threat management. And so in Hawaii, everyone here probably knows, we're known to be the extinction capital of the world. How did we get here? Well, it was a suite of factors that are actually still present today and contributing to threats of our native species that are still in existence. And then with climate change, that's just adding pressure and uncertainty to the situation. But a recent study shows that we actually know most of the solutions to protect or save our endangered species, and the technology exists today to implement those solutions. But why haven't we been super successful in stopping extinctions? Largely it's because we haven't been funded, we haven't had the funds necessary to implement the solutions that are required to save our species. And so how much does it cost? And what should we do with that money? Well, this is what we wanted to answer for the islands of Maui Nui. So we implemented the priority threat management process for Maui Nui. And for this project, we had a few different objectives. The first was identifying conservation actions that are going to result in the highest number of species secured per dollar. And this was over the next 20 years. So, you know, a lot of climate change models or other types of models forecast out to something like end of century. That's very challenging for managers and experts to wrap their head around. That time horizon. So for this particular project, we were focused on stopping extinctions within the next 20 years, which is something, again, that managers and experts could actually conceptualize and give us predictions for. We also wanted to identify actions that maybe only benefit one species or a few taxonomic groups, but they're really necessary to preventing extinction of those groups. And lastly, we wanted to identify species that are unlikely to be conserved if we don't invest in advancements in technology as well as infrastructure. So to do this, like I said, we sought out a group of about 100 species experts and land managers. We held a series of workshops, so over about 4 workshops and some pre-workshop focus groups. We worked with these folks to come up with a list of 15 species groups. So we grouped 266 species by how they respond to threats, and we came up with 15 groups. We came up with 4 vertebrate groups: water birds, forest birds, seabirds, and the Hawaiian forty bat. 5 invertebrate groups: terrestrial snails, insects, which were yellow-faced bees, picture winged flies, damselflies, and the blackburn's sphinx moth. And then plants were a little trickier. So we actually ran a separate analysis to group these. We grouped them by the threats that they have in common, but we used a principal component analysis to do so. So here, I don't have a great description. You'll see them later on, the threats that are for each of these groups, but essentially just know that yeah, each one of these groups faces similar threats. And then we came up with a set of 27 action sets. And those consisted of a few things. First, one of our action sets was a counterfactual of no action. And this was important to include because our funder, our decision maker, Scott Fretz, the Maui Nui DOFA branch manager, said that every year he's got to justify even getting funds to continue doing what he's doing, not even new actions, but just to continue the actions he's currently doing. And so we really wanted to show what would the probability of persistence be if we do nothing, if we cease all action. So whenever I refer in this presentation to the counterfactual, I'm referring to doing no more actions or protections, any existing infrastructure. We won't tear it down, but we're not going to be maintaining it anymore. Then we came up with 16 independent action sets. And what I mean by this, an example of an action set would be something like invasive predator control. So it's an action, a group of actions that's meant to address a particular threat. So for invasive predator control, this particular action had things like removing rodents with A24 traps, using a combination of traps to remove rats, cats, mongoose, removing cattle, egrets, barn owls. And the assumption is here that for each action set, we come up with 16 of these different ones. And for each one, the assumption is that if you were to adopt or plan to implement this action set, you would do all of the individual actions within this set. So if we want to address the threat of invasive predators, we have to do all of these actions. Then we also came up with 10 combinations of the independent action sets. So for example, this would be, what if we wanted to see what the benefit of doing invasive predator control, maintaining our existing ungulate fences, and also implementing invasive pest control. So those three are each independent action sets, but we wanted to see how doing combinations of things, in real life, we do those things, we do a suite of actions, right? So we wanted to see how these particular combinations provided benefits. So to calculate our benefits, we first defined what we meant by benefit, and we asked experts to make predictions about the probability of persistence. And this we defined as the chance that species groups will have self-sustaining populations in 20 years. Then we calculated the benefit, and then they provided us with this probability for both the counterfactual and all of the different, the independent action sets and the combination sets. And what we did was we took the change in the probability of persistence under each action strategy compared to the counterfactual. So that change in the probability of persistence that you get by doing an action compared to doing no action, that's the benefit. So what do we have to do to save all of our species? So this graph here in the blue bar shows you the maximum benefit or the maximum gain in persistence that you can get for each species group by doing all the sets of actions that are beneficial to that species, that are necessary to prevent extinction of that species. The counterfactual is in black. So if we didn't do any of those things, that's what the probability of persistence would be. We also elicited the current status. So where is the species at today? What is the probability of persistence today for each of these species groups? So next I'm going to break down what those actions are. So I just showed you the maximum gain you can get by doing all actions necessary for each species group. But what are those actions? So I'm going to show you that for each species group, but first just to orient you with what I'm going to be showing you. The graph here on the bottom, you have action strategies or action sets. In green are the independent action sets, and in purple are the combination action sets. On the y-axis, we have probability of persistence, and then every graph is going to have a line for the average counterfactual across all experts and the average current status across all experts for that particular species group. So it'll become more apparent when I show you the first example. So forest birds, the major threat to forest birds is avian malaria. And so the black dots are the probability of persistence under each of the different actions. And the red circles represent the biggest bumps that you get in persistence. And so for the forest birds, any action sets that are addressing avian malaria are going to give us some kind of bump. Same thing, seabirds and waterbirds. So both of these groups are majorly threatened by invasive predators. And same thing here, we see that we get the biggest bump from actions that are implementing predator control or predator exclusion fencing. Those are the action sets that are going to give us the biggest bump in persistence for these species groups. For the yellow-faced bees, major threats are invasive invertebrate pests and habitat loss. Therefore, the two action sets that give us the biggest bump include actions for controlling pests or coming up with new methods to control invertebrate pests, as well as habitat loss. For picture wing flies, their major threat is loss of host plants. So the action sets that are going to benefit this species group the most contain actions for preserving native plants that are of importance to this species. For damselflies, the major threat to this species group is loss of habitat. And so the action sets that are going to benefit this group or give the biggest bump are sets that include actions for habitat management or creating new habitat. The black-burned sphinx moth is majorly impacted by habitat loss and invasive invertebrate pests. Again, we see bumps in the action sets that are going to address these threats. Terrestrial snails. So terrestrial snails are heavily impacted by invasive predators. And while we do have methods for controlling rodents, which is one of their predators, we actually don't have effective methods for controlling other predators such as predatory snails or Jackson's chameleons. So for this species group, the thing that you have to do to save this species is predator exclusion fencing, as well as developing methods for controlling the invasive invertebrates, such as the invasive predators, such as the predatory snails and the Jackson. For the plant groups, I'm just gonna show you the plot for plant group 1. That's because all 6 plant group graphs look very, very similar. But the main takeaway from this is that, and they're all threatened by a suite of threats, including invasive ungulates, weeds, fire, loss of pollinators, etc. The thing that's different about these species groups from all of the other graphs that I showed you is there's not just one particular threat that if we manage for that one major threat, we can prevent extinction, like with avian malaria or the invasive predators. For plants, our results show that you have to do all of the actions to address all of their threats if we want to save these species. So that's the major take home for that, those species groups. For the Hawaiian Maui bat, wind turbines are the biggest threat to the species group. While we do have actions for addressing some of these, we don't actually, the type of wind turbine that we're using in Hawaii is not conducive to the Hawaiian Maui bat. So the type of infrastructure that we would need to use is not currently being used in Hawaii, and so we don't have much control over that. So our action sets didn't contain things that give a huge bump for this species group. So now I'm going to show you a breakdown of some of the costs. So what does it cost to implement these actions? And for non-recurring costs, these are more like upfront costs. They're not occurring every year. It's about $80 million. And the majority of these costs are coming from ungulate and predator fences, as well as predator eradication on the only island that we're planning to fully implement eradication. For reoccurring costs, so these are things that typically occur annually, the rough estimate, the average for reoccurring costs is about $30 million per year. And it's about a 50-50 split between salaries and materials. And for the salaries, that amount is equivalent to about 400 jobs, thereabout. So that's creating a lot of new jobs. And then if we look at the breakdown by year, we see again that a lot of the non-recurring or the upfront costs are happening within the first 10 years. These are largely costs for predator and ungulate fences. So those are happening within the first 10 years, and then after which it's just maintaining those fences and doing the other actions that occur annually. And then if we look at on a per dollar spent, if we look at how many species we can secure per dollar, the major take homes from this graph are, if you look, we start down at the bottom of the line at 0. No brainer if we don't spend any money, if we don't save any species. If we spend about $30 million, we can save just under 100 of our species. And then if we spend in that $40 to $60 million range, we get a huge jump in the number of species that we're going to secure. And the large jump in cost is largely for, these are species that require technology developments, building of new infrastructure, those types of things. So yeah, so we can save all of our 266 species in Maui Nui for just over 60 million. And so some initial impressions from this project are that actually our costs are consistent with what our colleagues at Fish and Wildlife Service are telling us. So the costs, the estimates they have for recovery plans are fairly similar to the estimates that we've come up with in our project. As I just mentioned, we need substantial investments in lifeboats to prevent extinctions. So these are things like to just, halt the extinction crisis. We need to build ungulate and predator exclusion fences, propagation facilities for plants, snails, insects, and forest birds. And then we need a substantial investment in future tools. So again, things like new infrastructure, and new technology, research and development. And then we also need to implement island-wide eradications of invasive predators and mosquitoes. Those two things are going to be key to recovering a lot of our at-risk species. And so this project has given us a way to wrap our heads around how we can go about transforming Hawaii from the extinction capital of the world to the recovery capital of the world. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of jobs, all of you, and I look forward to working with you to make that happen. With that, I will take any questions. We can dive in more on the figures.
Thank you so much, Kristen. So we have